an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Good morning. Here we go. 22nd day of June. First full day of summer in this part of the world. That's a nice start to the season. Yeah. Glad to hear that most people finally getting around to the idea that it's not the longest day of the year. Most amount of daylight. My former colleague from the days at CIUT, Rob Bradley, is a professor of mathematics, posted on social media yesterday. It's only 1 second more of daylight, but it is the longest bit of daylight that we're going to have in 2023. So today, pretty much like yesterday. Yeah, not bad. Welcome in. It's Dave Trafford. It's now and next for Story Studio Network. Yesterday we broke down the mayoral candidates wanting the mayor's chair here in Toronto. The election is Monday. At this stage, what does Toronto need? Probably something along the lines of a combination. It would be kind of cool if you could just kind of combine them. Of what Ana Bailao is saying, Mitzi Hunter is promising to do to pay for it. And then some of the ideas that Josh Matlow brings. You know? Once we hit post, though, yesterday, former Mayor John Tory came out and endorsed Ana Bailao. And all kinds of conversation this morning. Is it too little, too late? Does it hurt her? Does it not? It does not hurt her. In fact, this is, I think Tim Hudak nailed it. I heard him commenting on it. Tim's the former leader of the Progressive Conservatives here in Ontario, now is the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association. He said this is probably the most significant announcement made at all since John Tory said he was stepping down. That, in fact, the popular Tory is giving his blessing to Ana Bailao. And doing so out loud. Remembering that 60% of the people who voted in the last election here in Toronto voted for John Tory for mayor. Okay. John Tory overwhelmingly passed his budget back in February, March, before officially stepping down. And it was supported by council. His agenda is on the table. And that 8 of 25, 24 councillors in Toronto are supporting Ana Bailao. So it's not surprising that the mayor would come out, Mayor Tory that is, come out and support Bailao for the job. And the campaign calculus is interesting here. You know, I heard a lot of people saying, well, it's way too late, way too late, way too late. I got news for you. The amount of earned media that Ana Bailao had as a result of this creates a level of momentum, a perception of momentum. And in these stages of a campaign, that's important. But it's got people talking about Ana Bailao. That's never a bad thing. In the same conversation with John Tory, who is, as we pointed out, if he were running, would run away with this election. There are people who want to write his name in on the ballot. So for all of that, too little, too late, won't matter much. This is the final weekend. We're pushing into Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where if anybody's having a conversation about this is going to be the topic of conversation. John Tory likes Ana Bailao. I've already had people say to me, oh, okay, that salts it for me. I'm going to vote Bailao because John Tory likes her as the next mayor. So that's what's going on here in the city of Toronto. If you are living in the 416, make sure that you register and get to the polls and vote for whoever. There'll be a real over and under on how many votes the dog gets. 102 names are on the ballot. 101 are human. So away we go. Okay, it is Thursday here on Now and Next, and that means it's Feed Drop Thursday. And we are going back over the last couple of weeks, and we've been featuring the first show that we produced here at Story Studio Network. And it was conceived in May of 2021, officially launched in June of 2021, and ran for 12 weeks right through until the fall of 2021. It was called The Next Normal. And the whole premise of the show was to have a round table of big brains look at what we learned from COVID-19. What were the shortcomings? And there were plenty, and easy to point out. But in this series, we want to talk about the opportunities. Where is it that we need to actually focus our attention, our policy, our money, our politics, our governance, our businesses, to make sure there's not going to be another one. There'll be another crisis like COVID-19. And people keep saying, it was 100 years ago. No, it was actually 2003 in this part of the world when we were hit by SARS. Lower scale. But if you go back and consider the effect and impact then, that was pretty dramatic in terms of the effect it had on the economy here in Ontario particularly. So yeah, it's going to happen again. How do we fix that? Well, we need to induce a culture of innovation, and there's a grand opportunity to do that now with the lessons learned from COVID-19. So to lead the conversation for this issue of The Next Normal is our friend Sarah Thorne from Decision Partners.
Welcome back. I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford.
There's a bit of an elephant in the room. There are many elephants in this Next Normal room, but this one's a particularly big one because I think where we need to go with this conversation about pandemic and pandemic recovery is, policy and innovation. We have to talk about not just what has happened and what have we learned, but what are we actually going to do about all of this, and how are we going to do this?
Well, and it's going to require a couple of things. First is an understanding of where we were. So the lessons learned here are really important. We've talked the last few episodes about how we as individuals have kind of focused on our own sense of self-awareness and self-care and the benefits and the opportunities there and the things I think that we'll take forward. But let's face it, big institutions, government, corporations aren't really that nimble in being able to shift their sights. Never mind being innovative when it comes to dealing with new policy. But clearly, that's what we're going to need. If no other example is in healthcare and long-term care in this country, where we have seen a real problem and we have emphasized it, underlined it, put it in italics over and over again over the last number of years. If we do not learn from it this time, then it's our own fault. So how do we manage that moving forward? How do we get big institutions like government to get their heads around not just policy change, but innovation in policy?
And that's where we start to have conversations about, who are the leaders going to be? What does it mean to be courageous? Are we changing the meanings around innovation so that we can essentially move faster? I mean, even, at ground level, Dave Hardy talking about the fact that the pandemic shone a light on us not having policies for some very basic things like virus management, sanitation in some places. These are innovations that will need to happen quickly. These are policies that will need to be put in place fast by governments. So how is that going to happen? And how are we going to take initiative to make sure that happens?
So it's a good thing we have Sarah Thorne at the table. She is the president at Decision Partners, and this is exactly her wheelhouse, where Sarah is able to talk to policymakers and not only get their ear, but give us some sense of how these decisions are made around risk and our behavior. Sarah Thorne, when we look at the recovery is one thing, but I think has been sort of unanimous in the conversation to date that we can't just worry about the things in the moment. We are going to have to move forward with a longer view of a horizon in terms of recovery. And what is that going to mean in terms of policy that's not just going to affect us now, but we need to make changes that are generational in their impact for our kids and their kids. What are the lessons learned? And I know you do a lot of work in that area. So first, is there the courage to do this, to actually make the innovative policy changes that it's going to require? And how difficult is it to manage this in a world where we're dealing with these decisions and conversations in terms of a 4-year mandate or maybe a minority mandate in Ottawa? That really is, right now, I see as an obstacle to being able to do the things we really must be brave enough to do.
Absolutely. And I think that that's an important thing to think about. We're on this journey and we have to focus on adaptation and continuous adaptation, continuous learning by individuals, organizations, and society. This isn't something that can be solved in the next 4 years. And it's not something that we can just check the box and move on. There's tremendous opportunities that have come from this pandemic. And I'm really hoping that as we move into the next phase, let's call it pandemic recovery, if the vaccines and the public health measures and our collective behavior hold off a fourth wave, I think we really need to look longer term, and I think we need to look at the role of innovation. How can individuals, organizations, policymakers foster innovation? Innovation is so critical to building an adaptive and resilient society. And I think if we just think about what we've seen with the pandemic, we've seen unprecedented innovation. We've seen brilliant scientists, researchers, manufacturers, regulators, logistics experts, public health experts, many other people refocusing their talents, really pulling together, working across boundaries and across a whole bunch of different kinds of barriers to develop these miraculous vaccines, getting them through regulatory approvals in unprecedented time, getting them manufactured, getting them distributed, and getting them into people's arms. It's just been unbelievable. In Canada, the results are so dramatic, and we've seen really swift vaccine uptake, rapid decline in new COVID cases, and hopefully that will continue until the pandemic becomes endemic. And, our brilliant researchers invent boosters, and we get a booster shot every year or two. So researchers and scientists have looked at how to leverage what they can best learn. They're looking now, I know from the show that we did for the Army Corps with DARPA, there's scientists right now looking at these platforms that were created with for the vaccines, and they're looking at how can they use those same platforms to solve different kinds of cancers, solve different kinds of chronic diseases. I mean, how exciting is that? The innovation in public health and medicine is just extraordinary, and there's such a important future ahead for our scientists and researchers. But what if we all focused our thoughts and our innovation? What if we all focused on the pressing changes ahead, the radical changes in the workforce that Lisa's been talking about, climate change? Imagine the possibilities. So I want to talk about today, how do we unleash the creativity and innovation that we have in Canada? How do we unleash it? And what barriers do we need to remove? What do we need to be successful? I'm interested in hearing what my brilliant colleagues have to say.
I'd like to get a little more granular on innovation and creativity and so on. Urban planning came out of the Industrial Revolution and the public health movement, and seeing that we need to have our communities be healthy communities and add to that. What I'm seeing is that we have food safety standards. I know that somebody's inspected the restaurant and so on. We have water standard. I'm confident that I can drink it out of my tap. We have sanitation standards, all sorts of standards. What we don't have is a virus standard. We do see people wiping down tables, but have they all been wiped down? where's the filtration? Where's the disinfection? Where's the inspection of viruses? It's not there, and it needs to be there along with the standards and regulations. And so to me, I see that as kind of a very low-hanging fruit in terms of what we need to do in terms of innovation and creativity in the standard, to have that for our public spaces, our workplaces, our institutions, and our homes.
I have maybe a unique perspective. I've just in May published a playbook called Retain and Gain Career Management for the Public Sector. So I've spent the last year talking with policymakers as part of the research of the book, specifically on their own careers and their own work, and what do they need in order to continue to advance in their own careers. And one of the things that I am always struck when I'm speaking directly with those that are in the public sector and have jobs to think about these things and to set out policy and to have the 10 and 20 year time horizon in Canada is just how good they are, how smart they are, how plugged in they are, how much information and data they actually have. And then I'm always as well struck by the difference between how slow it takes for some of these things to actually happen, how much the story starts to become, when government catches up, when they realize that this is happening. I know that the people that are inside of those institutions know what's happening and know what they want to do. Somehow along the way, though, it gets lost between knowing what might be really interesting to try and to be really innovative, even within some of the public sector's innovation and policy sections that we may not typically think about as overly innovative. They know what they want to do, but there seems to be a lack of will to get it done, or political uncertainty or risk averseness that has all of this great stuff that we have. And we're not able to access it. And the proof point, I think, that the pandemic really showed is all the public sector pivoting that took place. If they didn't know what could be possible, they wouldn't have been able to do it so fast. If they had to go through a whole series of discussions and information gathering just to figure out what to do, they couldn't have pivoted to working from home on a dime. They know what to do. It's just getting it done that becomes the problem. And I don't know if my co-hosts have experienced the same thing within their own interaction with public sector or with policymakers. How do we break through that logjam?
I would almost propose the idea that a lot of the changes that we've seen through the pandemic isn't really what I would consider innovation. And I would like to make a distinction, because you can innovate when meanings are changing, or you can innovate when behaviors are changing. Very easy to innovate when behaviors are changing. Why? Because you're forced to. You're forced to. You have to survive. If you're a government body, you have to do certain things. You have to get the job done. You have to keep the system moving, the wheels running. And that's what we've done in the last couple of years. We've innovated because behaviors have had to change. We have not innovated because meanings were changing. And I'll give you one example without going into details, because I'm not allowed to talk about it. But we did contribute to an important body of research around the opioid crisis in the United States with one of the critical government bodies there. And one of their challenges was how to reframe the problem of the opioid crisis to create greater empathy among the average American consumer about the problem. And one thing we discovered was that the meanings were all around this notion of addiction. And when we think about addicts, when we think about addiction, no matter how politically correct we might be when we're in our circle of friends or on Facebook, the reality is that we other that group, and the moment we other that group, we have significantly less or zero empathy for their condition. However, when you actually explore how the meanings are changing around the opioid crisis, one thing you discover, one thread you discover, is this whole area of chronic pain. And suddenly you discover, hey, here's a way that we can actually open up the narrative around the opioid crisis and make it relevant to everybody. Because guess what? Half the American population suffers from chronic pain of some kind or the other. Suddenly you can relate to people who have been prescribed opioids, who now struggle with addiction. And I mention this because this is an example of changing meaning. And if you truly want to innovate, you innovate with changing meaning before the as the expression says, before the stuff hits the fan, right? And that's real innovation. And I think that's the part that I am yet to see amazing examples of.
I really like that distinction, Ujwal. I don't have anything to add. I just wanted to say that I think that's a really important distinction.
Let me just ask the group then, because when we start talking about innovation, the two things that I'm hearing here that stand in the way as obstacles, Sarah, to you is first is regulation. I understand Dave Hardy's point that we need to have some standard and regulation around public health concerns, but so much of what has happened is because we have dismissed some of the regulatory requirements around vaccines. We have changed how we approach that just because we needed to. So regulation gets in the way, but then to Ujwal's point, our own perception of things and the meaning of things gets in the way. So how do we kind of close that circle and make sure that we're not standing in our own way when it comes to the need to have innovative policy?
I think that we need to have a shared understanding at the policy level of what we mean by innovation. And innovation really means that people have to take risks. They have to try new things. And not all new things are going to work, but there's learning in everything that's done. And the reason that we were able to get vaccines so quickly is because people had been innovating using these different vaccine platforms for different things. And they say, wait, we can put these things together and voila, we've got these fabulous life-saving vaccines in unprecedented time. And I think that one of the things I've been on the advisory council for the Ontario Centres of Excellence Environment panel for many years. I also am a coach, an executive in residence at the Ivey School of Business, working with students on innovation. And I think that one of the challenges that we have is the process. We keep putting, from a policy point of view, we keep putting these barriers on the process so that you have to, the creative people, the innovators, the scientists, the engineers, they have to deliver results instead of within a certain period of time. That's how a lot of the funding works. Instead of delivering learning and learning from the experience of innovating. I think we need to really rethink what we mean by innovation and rethink how we're training students, really young students, to be innovative, to be creative, to take some risks, to learn from those things, to move on.
In an earlier episode, I took exception with the way that Ujwal had cast how employers were focusing wellness as something to sell to people. But now I want to come back at that and support the point that he was making in that episode by saying just the same way that wellness isn't a product that we can sell and solve a problem, innovation isn't a goal. Innovation's not a goal. It's not a title. It's not the headline that we should be chasing for its own sake. It's something that happens when all the rest of the conditions exist to enable us to be able to make the kinds of changes that we need so that we are responding to real shift in meaning and shifts in behavior. And I think that anytime I see a center where innovation is the goal, it's on the wrong track.
Exactly.
And it's like trying to sell a product for wellness. It's just never going to achieve what it's set out to do. The marketing is never going to actually make good on the promise.
So Dave Hardy, when we talk about planning, urban planning, I mean, I guess that's a really good example of innovation if we want to look at it historically. Where it bogs down, you will know this better than anybody, is that we have become sort of beholden to the system as opposed to seeing it as a living, breathing thing. And you often make that point when you start talking about the new suburbanism, that what we have can't be the end result, that we got to keep pushing this ball up the hill and responding to the needs of the community.
We're always fighting against people that are holding on to ideas and those old ideas that just don't seem to be changing. There's a comfort that people have in those ideas. And that goes with the planning profession as well, where we have a certain way of thinking about how we build our communities and our cities. and the relationships between suburban and rural areas. As I said in one of the earlier episodes, I'm kind of a black sheep of the planning profession, because I'm saying, hold on, we can think differently about how we do our plan our cities. The suburbs are important places to live. There's a sense of place. We need to have a relationship between rural areas and suburban and cities. And it's across a whole bunch of sectors, health, of course, transportation, housing, and so on. But you're just not that thinking happening, and it needs to.
And now's the opportunity. Now that we've got everybody reflecting on what we've been through with the pandemic, now's the opportunity to think about the integration of health, climate change, our living circumstances, our urban and rural communities, what kind of spaces we want to be in, and one of my favorite things, how we integrate natural and nature-based solutions into urban planning. I know some of you have been listening to our Engineering with Nature podcast that I host and Dave produces for the Army Corps of Engineers, but it's all about innovation. It's all about looking at new and different solutions where we're working with nature, bringing communities into nature and nature-based solutions and integrating those with traditional solutions. How do we just get out of the old mindset and move forward?
Sometimes these topics are really big and hard to kind of access to know, like, so how could we start to take that action today? And one thing that we lean on is an equation that we've come up for how you can shape the future as opposed to just reacting to what comes your way. And so the fundamentals of the equation in all of those different dimensions, Sarah, is to think about, how can we have a discussion, a really solid discussion on what's possible? And how can we have a really solid discussion on what we actually want? So if we think about what we want to be true for our children and grandchildren, what would that look like? So the combination of what's possible and what do we want over what period of time? What's the urgency to start to tackle it? If we use that equation in environmental policy, in planning policy, in health policy, in careers and employment, if we start to apply it where we break it down to what are the simple questions that everyone can be asking so that it's not, an innovation summit or an innovation center of excellence, but it's actually starting to think through how do we define what's possible, what do we want, and what's the period of time that we wanted to have this change happen in? We can actually start to access really innovative conversation without innovation being the headline.
One interesting idea or thought that I just wanted to bring up is there's this desire, and this is not just for the private sector, but also the public sector. There's this desire for innovation to work for everybody. And the reality is that it never does. Because if you're innovating by virtue, you're thinking about something that is applicable into the future, you are going to always begin with a smaller cohort of people, of your constituents. It's just the nature of change. Everybody does not embrace change at the same pace in the same way. It doesn't happen instantly. So I think the one barrier that the public sector has to get past and get comfortable with is the fact that they may be designing solutions and innovating on ideas that may not work for everybody at the same time or instantly. And there has to be a comfort level with that. And there has to be a framework that allows the public sector to do that without getting raked over the coals. So that's a critical piece. A private sector has to deal with that all the time. It's impossible for them to truly innovate without starting small. That's just the nature of innovation.
So there hasn't been an episode here where I haven't sat in on this conversation and I haven't learned something, and I think two things that I learned here. Dave Hardy giving us the perspective on urban planning. And in fact, noting that urban planning grew out of a public health crisis. It's a public health response. So in and of itself, the model, quote unquote, is innovative. Interesting to hear him say right now, given what we've been through, the model is not sufficient to deal with it. So there's the possibility, the opportunity to be innovative. Now, we've all talked about innovation and technology in big, broad strokes, and how great we've been at it because, for example, we've created these vaccines that have been miracle drugs in such a short period of time. We've got so many people vaccinated and rolled it out around the world, etc. But then you hear Ujwal, our Kulgut, our cultural anthropologist, and he's saying that's not really innovation at all.
I loved that sort of aha, or that what did he just say?
Yeah.
kind of perspective, but when you really listen to what he was saying, he's absolutely right, because and I mean, Lisa Taylor would say innovation is not the goal. And Ujwal was saying the vaccines, if we took that example, happened in a very short amount of time, but we can't call that innovation. We were in a pressure cooker to take what was available to us and create a solution. But if the pandemic hadn't existed, was that going to be a priority? Were we envisioning that? His point about innovation is that it comes when we, do the Wayne Gretzky thing and we can actually play to where the puck is going, not where it is. So I found that perspective intriguing, especially as we continue to have these conversations. And I have a feeling that the concept of innovation, the concept of courage, the concept of leadership is going to become really important and something we're going to want to continue to unpack, given the fact that we don't really agree about what innovation actually looks like.
Yeah, that's right. And this is going to make us rethink all of that. And I think where we'll want to be innovative, and we'll get into this in the upcoming episodes, but is in identifying the new skills we're going to need and the new skills we're going to have to encourage, not just for the workforce, but for leadership in all aspects of life. So let's take that innovation definition that Ujwal gave us, not to be reactive, but to be forward thinking in his terms, and see how that plays out.
The Next Normal is sponsored by Challenge Factory, shaping the future of work.
By Decision Partners. Our world is a better place when we make better decisions.
By Motive Base, decoding implicit meaning behind what people talk about.
And by Hardy Stevenson and Associates, planning the cities of the future.
Comments, questions, or ideas for our hosts? Feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com.
This series is produced for the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.
This
is SSN.